Hello, everyone. Welcome to the migration session. One of the last parallel sessions of our conference today. Thank you for joining us. We have a very nice lineup of papers, and you did a great choice by coming to a migration session, because I think migration is one of the concepts that brings together the three themes of the panel: population, poverty, and inequality. So in the session, we have three speakers, Esteban Quiñones, Binkania Nantom, and Lin Nguyen, and we will play their videos one after the other, and afterwards they will each provide a very short discussion on the paper that followed theirs, and afterwards we will take some questions. Now, all of you have been made speakers as well, so you can see who the other participants to the session are, but it also means that you cannot ask questions in the Q&A option of Zoom. So if you have any questions or remarks or comments, please put them down in the chat box, okay? And we will give you the floor in the Q&A session if you want to maybe elaborate a bit on the questions. Now, let's have the first video, which is that of Esteban. Great, thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Esteban Quiñones, and I'm a researcher at Mathematica. And I'm presenting joint work today with Sabine Lebenhem at the University of Saskatchewan and Rasadika Sharma at Leibniz University, Hanover. Our work is entitled Left Home High and Dry, Reduced Migration in Response to Repeated Droughts in Thailand. Our work is primarily about exploring the relationship between environmental shocks, behavioral mechanisms, in particular risk attitudes, as well as economic well-being, which we measure in terms of consumption and value of assets, in addition to income, and how all those things shape migration decisions. So the specific question that we ask is whether consecutive droughts influence migration from rural Thailand and Vietnam. In asking those questions, we also dig a bit deeper into the potential mechanisms that I've mentioned above, with a focus on risk aversion and different measures of socioeconomic status. The other sub-question that we look into is whether the patterns that we observe are consistent with poverty traps. Given how short the presentations are, I'm going to jump right into a snapshot of our findings. So we show that consecutive exposure to droughts does decrease migration for any member of the household by 11%. And this is migration that is of the, let's say, the long-term variety, so of 180 days or longer. So we look into how consecutive droughts impact these mechanisms. And so what we're able to observe is that the consecutive droughts increase risk aversion by 10% and then reduce the value of assets and consumption by 37% and 10% respectively. So the assets and consumption are, let's say, italicized here because those are the ones that we see as being most important for shaping migration decisions. Those really are the ones that translate into a reduction in migration. And we see less of a clear relationship between risk aversion and migration decisions. So we see the strongest reductions in migration among poor households, as well as rural, urban, interprovincial, and labor migration motivated households. And finally, we do see that the results are consistent with mobility and poverty traps. We'd like to highlight three different policy implications from this work. The first is that social safety nets need to be strengthened and become more responsive to climate change. Cash transfers have become quite common, and in some locations there are now some insurance schemes as well, but most of them are not especially sensitive to drought and other extreme weather events. In terms of income diversification, this needs to focus both on activities within agriculture as well as outside of it. But what we really want to emphasize is that there also needs to be an emphasis on climate change mitigation and adaptation measures as part of income diversification. And then finally, we show that although migration is reduced, many households still engage in it. And given that we want to ensure that migrating households, including the individuals who migrate themselves, as well as the individuals that are left behind in origin communities, benefit as much as possible from migration. I'm going to switch gears and look into the conceptual foundations of our work. So we develop a poverty traps model, but I won't be presenting that for lack of time. And instead, I want to focus on the different ways in which climate change can influence migration. So there are two main branches that are typically considered. One is the increase in the incentive to migrate. And so that might be both because prospects in a community that are affected by extreme weather events might be seen as lower or less, let's say, less beneficial as well. And that may be both in terms of labor, but also human capital accumulation. And then there's a separate branch that considers how these types of events might limit the capacity to migrate. So that may be both because labor is tied up in climate mitigation measures, but also because of a lack of financial capital, lack of funds to pay for the costs of these journeys. So these are the different pathways that we have in mind. And then among the poor, there's a particularly big concern of the possibility of environmentally induced poverty traps. So the idea that poorer or more vulnerable households and communities are those that are going to be most affected by climate change. And if those shocks also reduce migration themselves, then these types of households and populations in these communities may end up trapped in locations where they're especially marginalized and vulnerable. So the mechanisms that we described earlier can be shown in this way, where an extreme weather event might have a sort of direct effect on the motivation to migrate, but where there are also these indirect effects here through socioeconomic status that we're measuring in terms of income, consumption, and assets, or through other behavioral mechanisms. And in this case, we are looking into risk attitudes, which are certainly going to play a role in the perceptions about let's say, investing in certain things, and in some ways, whether or not it is, let's say, too risky to migrate and things of that variety. And here we, just to highlight, we cite Acharya et al. Because we follow their approach in terms of how we study mechanisms. So I won't get into too much detail on that from here on out, because of the lack of time. I'm going to describe the data that we use here briefly, which is a combination of panel data and rainfall and temperature data. So the panel data we use is the Thailand-Vietnam Socioeconomics Panel, and that's a 6-wave study over more than 10 years, and it gives us a stratified random sample of roughly 3,500 households that are located in 439 different villages. And the areas included in the study are those that are in the darker blue here in Thailand, and then here in Vietnam. And so this is, let's say, eastern central Thailand, and then this is let's say, more just central Vietnam as opposed to far north or far south. And these are all relatively rural, poor areas that are vulnerable to climate change, and especially to drought, because they are almost entirely dependent on rain-fed agriculture. So we integrate information from that survey with historical rainfall and temperature data from a few different sources, from the Global Precipitation Climatology Center, as well as from the Global Historical Climatology Network and the Climate Anomaly Monitoring System. And we're using data spanning back from 1948, and the data we're using is a half-degree resolution, and that's what we use to construct our measures of drought. So our dependent variable is a household level measure that takes a value of 1 when any member of the household migrates for 180 days or longer from the home. Otherwise, it's 0. So in other words, it's a way of measuring the incidence that a household engages in migration. And you can see here on the left in the pooled sample that this was less than 40% of households in 2007, but has jumped over that and is almost reaching 50%, half of households. You can also see on the right here slightly different patterns for Vietnam in red and Thailand in blue, with Vietnam having a slower increase as well as a lower starting point, and slowly but surely increasing over the years, but still just shy of 40%, and then higher levels in Thailand, but more of a jump in 2007 to 2010, and then a bit more of a leveling off. So our measure of drought, which is essentially, let's say, our treatment variable or our exposure measure, is a standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index that we construct at the sub-district level. And so the nice thing about this is that it's a multi-scalar index that takes into account precipitation and temperature, as well as evapotranspiration. And evapotranspiration is essentially the process by which water is transferred from the land to the atmosphere, and that's taking place in terms of evaporation from the soil and other surfaces, as well as transpiration from plants. So it's a relatively comprehensive measure. And then the format of the SPI is such that it's standardized so that comparisons can be made over space and time. And so a value of less than 1 is indicative of a moderate drought. So here you can see some box plots for the pooled, let's say, Thailand and Vietnam samples. And you can see that there are many cases where the box plots are to the left of this red line, which is where the -1 point is. And in fact, we see droughts in many different years: 2007, 2010, 2013, 2016. And then in some locations, there's a bit more variation, as in 2017, where there's clearly some in Thailand, but not in Vietnam. And we really see drastic droughts both in 2013 across the board, and then in 2016, with it being much worse in Thailand, but still quite bad. So our empirical strategy is a panel regression with this household level migration variable on the left-hand side. We're controlling for drought and time t, and then the lag drought, the previous year's drought. And then what we're really focused on is our estimate of the beta-3 coefficient, which is the interaction of these two time periods of drought. Excuse me. And we're controlling for a whole host of things, particularly a vector of different village controls that, let's say, change, that are time varying. And then we have household fixed effects, village fixed effects, and time fixed effects. So when it comes down to it, we're really identifying our study off of variation in drought conditions within this sub-district level, and how those vary over time, net of any household unobservable characteristics that we want to account for. And standard errors are clustered at this sub-district level. So the summary of our results can be shown here in this figure, where you see that the axis, the y-axis shows that 0 is right here. And so all of the effects we're finding are these points in blue. And so for long-term migration, which is of 180 days or longer, we see a 5.3 percentage point reduction, which is a large effect that translates to the decrease of roughly 11%. And what we can see here in this figure is that it's primarily driven by migration that is associated with labor. So moving for the purposes of work, that we see roughly a 5 percentage point decrease for labor. And certainly that's not surprisingly mostly rural to urban, as we see at this point here, which is, let's say, larger than 4 percentage point reduction. And that kind of correlates with what we might think with most of that being interprovincial as opposed to intra-provincial. We do see a reduction in short-term migration as well, but not nearly as large of one. There is also, let's say, a statistically significant reduction for rural to rural migration as well. So, when we look at that in terms of a table format, you can see, let's say, they're not in the exact same order because that figure was sorted by, let's say, largest to smallest impacts, but you can see this long-term coefficient here, and then the labor one here, followed by urban and interprovincial. And so what we can say overall is that there's certainly a decrease in migration associated with, let's say, the consecutive droughts. We certainly, want to see if our results are sensitive to a number of things. And so we test against attrition bias. We use a number of different alternative model specifications, where, of course, there's, some variation in what the main coefficient looks like, but is often quite similar to the one in our preferred specification. And then we also test against, let's say, the possibility that our survey-based measures of risk might reflect other things. So in summary, what we're showing is that consecutive exposure to droughts really does reduce long-term migration substantially, and that this is primarily operating through this socioeconomic status channel. But we do also see a substantial increase in risk aversion. That's one point. And then another one is that what we do observe is consistent with the idea of kind of a mobility and poverty trap, which we could think of as, let's say, an environmentally induced poverty trap, and could also be described as kind of a set of feedback loops in which the most vulnerable, poor households are those that are least likely to move, and that's quite worrisome for moving forward. And we also highlight, let's say, three kind of core planks for policy implications in terms of safety nets that are responsive to climate change, as well as income diversification and maximizing migration outcomes. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Looking forward to the discussion and your feedback.
Great. So thank you so much for this first video. Now we will move to the second one, and the second presentation from Linh Nguyen on Vietnam. So we're more or less staying in the same region. So Jill, can you please play the second video? Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you for attending my talk today. My name is Linh Nguyen. I'm currently a visiting assistant professor at Bates College. It is my pleasure to participate in this virtual conference, and I'd like to take this opportunity to present my project on land rights and migration in Vietnam. What we observe in many developing countries is a large urban-rural wage gap. In Vietnam, income per hour is 70% higher in urban than in rural area. Some may argue that people in urban areas get higher paid because they are more educated, they have more skills and experience. However, Munshi and Rosen-White documented that in India, for example, the gap for male labor with less than primary education between urban and rural areas is 27%. So at the same education level, the wage gap persists. There is also evidence of substantial gain for migration, including seasonal migration. In Bangladesh, a study by Brian and colleagues find that just giving rural people the amount of cash that equals a bus ticket to the city increases seasonal migration by 60%, and by that increases the expenditure by 30 to 35%. If migration to urban areas can increase earnings for migrants and the welfare of rural households, It is puzzling that migration rate remains low in these countries. Therefore, it is important to understand the market frictions that prevent people from migration. The lack of well-defined land rights in developing countries is one of the barriers that can hinder labor mobility. One reason is that without land titles, a household faces the risk of expropriation, so they have to assign labor to occupying and actively using the land. With a land title, land security is improved. This labor is released and they can move away from their land to seek non-farm jobs. This is called the tenure security channel. Another potential channel is the credit channel. When a household is financially constrained to fund the cost of migration, having land titles helps relax their constraint by allowing them to use their land as collateral to borrow money. However, better land rights also encourage households to increase their agricultural investment and potentially improve agricultural productivity. This makes working on farm more attractive and discourages migration. So there are potential competing effects of improved land rights on migration, and the overall effect is ambiguous. So it is important to understand the empirical impact of land policies on migration. So in this paper, the first research question is that what is the effect of having land titles on seasonal migration of rural households in Vietnam? I explored the variation in the timing of land title obtainment across households using household panel data from 2006 to 2010. The variation comes from the staggered process of land title issuance that started in 1993 by the government. Due to administrative capacity, households receive land titles at different times over the years. The panel data allows me to compare households before and after getting the titles. What I find is that having land titles increases migration both at the extensive and intensive margins. Having land titles increases the likelihood of having a migrant in the households by 5.2 percentage points, and the number of migrants by 0.11 migrant per household, which is 33% of the mean. The second question is, how do the effects of having land titles on migration differ across different groups? I built a simple model to understand the different channels to which better land rights affect migration and form predictions about heterogeneous effects across wealth groups and types of migration. And by types of migration, I mean migration for work and migration for education. With this testable hypothesis, I look at the data, and what I find is consistent with what the model predicts. First, there are heterogeneous effects across households' wealth distribution and types of migration. Improved land rights appear to have the largest effects for households that are close to the financial thresholds of the migration cost. This result suggests the presence of the credit channel. Secondly, female migrants drive the increase in migration for education, and male migrants drive the increase in migration for employment. Now I will talk about the background of the land titling program in Vietnam. Before 1993, households were allocated agricultural land and took control of production. However, they didn't have legal land titles for their plots, and land transactions remained illegal. The land law of 1993 gives households the right to transfer, exchange, rent, inherit, and mortgage their land use rights. It was implemented by issuing land use certificates, or LUC. With this certificate, land security is improved, tenure is guaranteed for 20 years for annual land and 50 years for perennial land, with possibility of renewal. Land transactions were also legalized. The titling program rolled out at the same time across the country. Households first applied to receive LUC. District Bureau of Land Administration examined the applications, did the groundwork, and issued the title. It was a long process due to the limited human capacity of the Bureau and land officers. Thus, households received their land titles in a staggered manner. I will explore the variation in the timing of getting LUC across households. Because of time limitation, I will not present the model and only focus on the empirical analysis. The data in this study come from the Vietnam Access to Resources Household Surveys, which is a biennial panel data set. I used 3 waves of the surveys, 2006, 2008, and 2010. This data set focuses on rural areas covering 12 provinces across the country. From these surveys, I formed a balanced panel of 1,910 households. The definition of seasonal migration here is consistent with the literature. A migrant member is a household member that was absent for at least a month in the last 12 months. A migrant household is a household that has at least a migrant member. The richness of the data allows me to more closely examine the characteristics of migrants, which help illuminate the different channels. The surveys also have information about land title obtainment by a household. This information is specified for all the plots that the household owns. I use a diff-in-diff identification strategy here. At the household level, I regress migration outcomes on the dependent variable LUC, which can be a dummy of whether the household has any LUC or whether all plots have LUC or the fraction of plots that have LUC. The regression also includes household fixed effects and common time fixed effects. The household fixed effects can account for time invariant household-specific characteristics such as household size, productivity, household head's gender, education, and political connection. The common time fixed effects can account for any input price shocks, seasons weather, or natural disasters specific to the region that may induce flows of migration. It can also control for variation in the local land title registration process between communes over time. A large number of controls makes it unlikely that my results are driven by omitted variables. Here are the regression results for the effect of having land title on household migration decision. 2 outcome variables considered here are whether the household has any migrant, columns 1 to 3, and the number of migrants per household, column 4 to 6. The red number in column 1 suggests that having LUC for any plot increased the probability that a household has a migrant member by 5.2 percentage points. Given that in 2006, 24% of households had a migrant member, this increase is equivalent to about 20% of the mean, which is certainly non-trivial. In column 2, conditional on having any LUC, we see that whether the household has fully registered their land does not matter, while the coefficient for having LUC dummy remains positive and significant. Column 3 shows that the fraction of plots that got LUC also does not matter, as the estimated coefficient is positive but not significant. Columns 4 to 6 report regression results where the outcome variable is the number of migrant members in a household. In column 4, having an LUC increases the number of migrants per household by 0.107 migrants, which amounts to 33% of the average number of migrants per household in 2006. Again, having all plots fully titled or more plots titled does not have significant effect conditional on having an LUC, as shown in columns 5 and 6. Even though the effect of land rights on migration is positive, it is different across the wealth distribution. When I break down households into quartiles based on their wealth, households in the third quartile are those whose decisions are most affected, as the coefficients for this group are statistically significant and the largest in magnitude among all groups. In this group, having any LUC increased the chance of having a migrant by 16% and the number of migrants by 0.26 per household, much larger than the estimates in the general results. Overall, the middle group observes larger change than the top and the bottom of the distribution. This is consistent with what is predicted by the credit channel. The effect should be strongest for those who are close to the threshold of the financial constraints. It is because the financial constraints are not biting for the richest households, while it is not enough for the ones with lowest wealth level to afford the cost of migration, even with the relaxation of credit given by having land titles. Only households in the middle of the wealth distribution benefit, as their land titles give them a sufficient boost to overcome the financial constraint. My theoretical framework also predicts that the financial thresholds of education migrants can be higher than that of work migrants, because the cost of education migration is higher. I break down the effects of having land titles on two types of migration for different groups of wealth. For work migration, the middle wealth group, second and third quartiles, observes the largest effect, even though statistically insignificant, while the poorest and richest groups do not see much effect. For education migration, we see the largest positive effects for households in the fourth quartile, the wealthiest group, both in the extensive and the intensive margin. It appears that the effects are strongest in the groups whose level of wealth correspond to the cost of each type of migration. I also break down the effects of migration for work and education by genders. Looking at work migration, we see that the positive effect is strongly different by male, 2.6% and 3.4% for the extensive and intensive margins, while the coefficients for female are very close to zero. However, for education migration, the effects are positive and significant only for female migrants. The case of Vietnam shows that the effect of improved land rights can be important to women as they are able to migrate for attaining more education and potentially earn higher wages in the future. So in conclusion, well-defined land rights can affect migration through multiple channels, including improved tenure security and relaxing credit constraints. Using panel data, I empirically showed that there's a positive link between having land titles and migration decisions. The effect of having land titles is heterogeneous in wealth and types of migration, suggesting a credit channel story. Improved land rights also significantly increase female migrants for education.
Great, thank you so much for such a clear video and very interesting one. Now, the next presentation is from Binganika on immigration shocks and macroeconomic fluctuation in ECOWAS countries with evidence from Nigeria. Thank you, Jill.
Dear participants of second EUSSP Population and Inequality Research Conference 8 to 10 December 2020. The title of our presentation is Immigration Shocks and Macroeconomic Fluctuation in ECOWAS country. Evidence from Nigeria, presented by Begenkia Nantob, PhD student in Economic Science at the University of Lomé. The plan of our presentation is as follows. After the context and problematic, we present the objective and assumption. Then the methodology, followed by the result and discussion, and finally the conclusion and the economic implications. With regard to the context and problematic, according to neoclassical theory, the determinant of migration lies in the unequal geographical distribution of the availability of factors of production such as labor, capital, and natural resources, the endowment of which are a priori given. According to them, the unequal geographical distribution of factors of production determine a priori the remuneration of the different factors of production, which are also unequal. Thus, according to the neoclassical, in some regions, labor is relatively more abundant, capital more scarce. In others, it is the opposite. Under these conditions, neoclassical theory explains migration by the fact that labor moves to where it is better paid. It should be noted that change in labor market supply are not without consequences for the economy. Labor supply shocks and labor market wage bargaining are important drivers of output and unemployment in the short and long run. Immigration as a labor input causes the variation of economic variable in the labor market. The analysis of the relationship between immigration and variable leads to mixed results. For researchers such as Bozias, immigration reduced the wage of competing workers, while for other, immigration increased the average wage of autochthons. The discovery of oil and its exploitation during the 1970s made Nigeria as an area of activity of ethnic migrants in ECOWAS through the resulting increase in ICA. Between 1990 and 2017, Nigeria recorded an increased rate of 63% higher than that of ECOWAS, 33%, and Côte d'Ivoire, 17%. Between 2010 and 2018, ethnic migrants transferred more than 5.6 billion US dollars to other ECOWAS countries outside Côte d'Ivoire, while those transferred by ethnic migrants to Côte d'Ivoire are estimated at 4.7 billion US dollars. An analysis of the comparative evolution between immigration and economic variables, in particular the relationship between the two variables, in views of the analysis of the facts in the Nigeria and the mixed conclusion of the work, the following research questions arise. What effect do immigration shocks have on macroeconomic variables in ECOWAS, particularly in Nigeria? The main objective of this study is to assess the effect of immigration shocks on macroeconomic fluctuation in ECOWAS, particularly in the case of Nigeria. Especially, it is aimed at determining the role of immigration in the variation of GDP per capita, labor supply, labor productivity, unemployment, consumer price credit to the private sector, public expenditure, and tax revenue. From this specific objective follow the assumption that immigration play an important role in the variation of macroeconomic variables in Nigeria. The structure of the labor market in Nigeria indicate that the self-employer occupy a significant share of the labor market with 54%, followed by salary employer, whose market share is estimated at 38%. Employer and apprentice share a lesser share of the labor market at 4.3% and 2.1% respectively. The self-employer are mainly divided between two sectors, namely agriculture and commerce, a large part of which is in the informal sector. According to several data from the Manpower 204 provided by most internal migrants is mainly found in the primary sector and in the tertiary sector. Marginal economy grew from 206 to 207 is attributed to the non-oil sector, namely telecommunication and wholesale and retail trade, which contribute 28% and 12% respectively to Nigeria economic growth. Like the previous work, we adopt a structure VAR model whose expression is the following. In order to estimate this model, we pass through the reduced form, which is obtained by multiplying the two members of equation 1 by A. The restriction of the structure VAR allows us to obtain the vector of structure shock and the matrix. To make the matrix of shocks identifiable, additional restrictions are needed, and the table indicates that the restrictions are validated because the probability of the likelihood statistic doesn't erroneously reject the validity of the restriction. The immigration data are taken from the statistical database of the United Nations Population Department and cover the period from 1990 to 2017. These data take into account only immigrants between the age of 15 and 65 in order to comply with the age of the labor force set by the International Labour Organization. Other data are from the World Bank and the ILO statistic database. The results suggest that an immigration shock has a positive effect on GDP per capita, real wage, labor supply, consumer price, and credit to the private sector, but no significant effect on unemployment, public spending, and tax revenue. The analysis of the variance decomposition of the focus error indicate that the real GDP per capita, labor supply, productivity, and consumer price is explained largely by innovation in these variables and in immigration. Innovation in immigration make a small contribution to the variance of the focus area of private sector credit, public expenditure, and tax revenue. As conclusion, immigration play an important role in the variation in GDP per capita, real wage, labor supply, and consumer price because the contribution of its innovation is major in the variation in the focus area of these variables. However, the contribution of immigration is marginal in the change in the focus area of private sector credit, government expenditure, and tax revenue. As economic implication, the Nigeria and even ECOWAS authority will henceforth have to integrate immigration as an important economic indicator of macroeconomic stabilization. The Nigeria authorities need to take steps to facilitate not only but also the integration of migrant workers in the Nigeria labor market. Dear participants, we are at the end of our presentation. Thank you for your kind attention.
Great, thank you so much for this very interesting video. So, Bikinginya, maybe you can start and discuss Esteban's paper. I don't know, do you have slides, or would you just like to say a few words? Your microphone is muted. You need to unmute yourself. Let's see if this works. Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you. Hello. I don't have the slide.
It's not a problem. We look forward to listening to your comments.
To beginning is an honor to attend in the IUSSP conference, and I would like to congratulate the organizer of this conference and thank them for giving me the opportunity to discuss a paper in this great event. I'm very glad to Esteban presentation. My discussion will be brief. So, Esteban paper deal with migration, which is a topical term. The paper of Esteban Quinonce contains in general the different parts recommended for a scientific article. The methodology used by the author to estimate his assumption is inspired by previous work in the literature, which has allowed the development of an empirical model and interesting results. However, we have some background observation to make. Indeed, the abstract of a scientific article should include three fundamental elements: the main objective, the methodology used, it means the model, the estimate technique, and the data, and finally the result obtained. We note that this is not the case in in this paper, because in the abstract of the paper, the model and the technique used are missing. We also note that the choice of the two countries considered for the study, Thailand and Vietnam, was not sufficiently justified in the introduction. The author merely stated that both countries, notably Vietnam and Thailand, have experienced significant wave of migration, while there was agreement on relevant comparison based on figure with other countries in the same region, such as Laos, Cambodia, or even other regions of the world that also experience significant migratory movement. Thus, migration is a complex concept without two components, immigration and immigration. The author has not made clear in the title as well as in the rest of the paper whether it refers to immigration or immigration of household in Thailand and Vietnam. The author has also failed to provide sufficient justification as to why migration or drought is a problem in Vietnam and Thailand, and what are the various previous measures taken by the authority of the country concerned, including Vietnam and Thailand, to deal with it. My question is why the author chose the term migration instead of immigration, since this is what the paper is about. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And now maybe I'll leave the floor to Esteban for his discussion on this paper.
Great, yeah. First, thank you for those comments, and now I will discuss Lynn's paper, which I was quite interested both to be working on same, let's say, context, but also to almost see the exact same, let's say, percentage point magnitude in the opposite direction to the main effect in my paper, which was just kind of amusing, let's say. So this is a really nicely composed analysis of the relationship between land rights and migration. And so the author shows an increase in let's say, internal migration associated with having stronger land rights. And this is, let's say, particularly tied to the land titling program. And I want to mention a few things, so a few that I particularly liked. So a lot of work has been done looking at land titling programs, and certainly they do take into account, let's say, the labor constraints, but often these programs are focused on agricultural production, agricultural intensification, and there have been what I would describe as varying results in summary in terms of the agricultural productivity impacts that we want to see. And so I appreciate, let's say, looking outside of that scope to see what other impacts there are that might be both large in magnitude, but also influential. And then the second piece that I also want to emphasize that I quite like is how well the author highlights, let's say, different components of migration. So the non-employment, in a sense, the human capital side of the story, I think is something that has emerged in many countries. And so it's quite important, and that, also quite closely correlates to the issue of gender and who migrates, and in terms of really emphasizing the role of women. I certainly, let's say, have some work in Mexico that has some of the same kind of flavor to that. So in terms of suggestions, I do think that it would be worthwhile to even have a bit of a broader framing in terms of policy. And it's not that there aren't policy implications here, but you know, when these types of policies are designed, even though they might take into account labor, they really are with, I think, a different primary objective in terms of, let's say, agricultural production and improving livelihoods, let's say, directly in rural and agricultural areas without necessarily motivating migration or people to leave. And so there's a kind of a bigger picture question here about what do people, and to be specific, ministries and policymakers who are reaching for those objectives, what are they to take, in a sense, from these types of results? And part of my thought process there goes along with thinking about the different mechanisms at play. So, one way in which these credit constraints are loosened is not just in being able to use land as collateral, but also, for example, this is just a hypothetical, that land is invested in with that credit, and in fact incomes rise, and that some of those returns are actually then used to fund migration. And that's, I don't think that's what's going on, but that's completely consistent, let's say, with the results you show, versus one where it's all used, or mostly used, in a sense, as a substitute and directly invested into migration. And I think that's a really important piece, both to understand the full picture, but also for the practical, let's say, policy dimension. And then I have some other, let's say, technical points, but I think I can just email those and we can discuss in the future. But that was kind of the biggest one that I really wanted to raise today.
Great, thank you so much. And now Lynn for her discussion on Bikinia's paper, and then I will ask Marie maybe to take over for any questions and also maybe the reactions of the authors to the discussion and other replies.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Esteban, for your comments. Let me say a few words about Bikinia's paper. So this paper examines the effect of immigration shocks on macroeconomic variables such as GDP, unemployment, labor supply, and real wages in Nigeria using a structural VAR model and the Bayesian approach. I really enjoy reading the paper, even though I have to admit I haven't been reading this type of macro paper for a while. What I like about this paper is that first, it fills a gap in the literature by addressing the effects of immigration on a host country in a developing country context rather than in a developed country, which is a more common topic of other studies. Furthermore, it focuses on macroeconomic fluctuations in a general equilibrium setting, while most of other papers look at microeconomic relationship and the impact in certain markets. And even though we cannot see all of it here in his presentation because of time limitation, in the paper, he provides very detailed interpretation for each result and the possible explanation that leads to these results. I really like that about the paper, and I learned a lot about the Nigerian economy as well. What I hope the paper and the presentation a bit clearer about is how immigration is defined. Is this permanent immigration or temporary immigration? Does the labor force participation or labor supply include these immigrants if they are not permanent residents? And do you have demographic information about immigrants such as age, gender, marital status? I'm curious to know more about it if data is available. Also in the paper, you emphasize that the informal sector plays a very important role in Nigeria, and this informal sector absorbs a lot of low-skilled migrants. You also mentioned that there is a mismatch between college graduate skills and the skills needed in higher productivity jobs that leads to these graduates joining the labor force but are unemployed. So these two main arguments are used to explain many findings in the paper, and even though it appears very reasonable, it may sound a little bit of speculation as the paper doesn't provide any data or pin down any correlation relationship to strengthen these claims. Maybe I'm missing something, but I hope to see more of it in the paper. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to the three of you for very, very thoughtful discussions. Now, Marie, I will let you take over. So Marie Lebrand, the director of ACER and one of the co-chairs of the panel. The floor is yours.
Yes, greetings, everybody. And so having taken over, you do have rights just to turn on your video and actually ask a question or make an input yourself. Anda has tabled a question to Esteban and Lynn, and you can come back to that when you reply in your responses. Please, from the floor. I know you're sitting on some questions. I can just feel it.
I think that Lynn also had a question for Esteban.
Sorry, who had a question?
Lynn.
Oh, I should. Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. I wrote it in the chat. So I was just wondering how you measure risk aversion. Yeah, just a clarification
question. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Of course, in a longer presentation, we detail many more things, and in this case, we really do almost a mediation style analysis to try and understand the mechanisms. There are a lot of details. So this is one of them. In this case, we're really measuring what I would call willingness to take risk, which is kind of the, let's say, the flip side of risk aversion. And we're using a series of subjective measures about the respondents' willingness to take on risk. So this is what is a pretty well validated, let's say, sequence. At this point, I think originated work under domain. Of course, you know, we in a different world, I would also like to have an incentivized experiment embedded into the survey to be able to, you know, essentially, you know, show these aspects as well. But we, you know, generate a Likert scale directly from this measure, and then we can calculate standardized scores such as sorry, I thought I had this one ready, but it's somewhere else. Let's say different sorts of either z-scores, and we do a lot of work to try and show the extent to which the results are actually consistent regardless of the type of respondent and the correlation between willingness to take risk with other factors, because I think that's, you know, that's a natural question in this context. So I'll stop there for now, but yeah, that's how we're operationalizing that here.
Thank you. Anybody else? Last chance from the participants. Perhaps in the meanwhile, while people are thinking, oh, Rocco, were you ready to come in?
No, I just turned on my video to turn on my video.
Well, nice to see you anyway.
Nice to see you too.
Perhaps Esteban and Lynn can address Anders' question. Lynn, why don't you start?
I'll say after Lynn.
So
I can also try to be clearer because I might not have been very clear. So let me know.
yeah,
if you want me to rephrase.
so I'm not sure if I understand your question.
Yeah.
So are
so-
you talking? Yeah. Actually, can you?
I was thinking about destination effects and especially if the land titling might have an impact on choosing a different destination for migration. I mean, can it maybe trigger people who are just thinking around moving to a nearby village to moving in a city? Or something like that. And then I was also thinking about the labor demand, because I would guess that once they get the titles for the land, one of the uses of the land is also to cultivate it and work on it. So that might also increase labor demand in the region of origin. So I was wondering how this might have impacted migration.
Yeah, so I guess I will answer the second question first. So about the labor demand. So in my paper, I also talk about one potential effect, which is when you have better land rights, you are more likely to invest in better technology. And actually, one of my other papers about in the same context found that when people have land rights, they are more likely to invest in improved seed adoption. And so that potentially increase your productivity, and it will make you, given that you have higher productivity, it may make migration less attractive, right? So I in thinking about the mechanism and like the potential forces, I also think that it's a positive, it can have positive effect, but is that bigger than the other effects? And that's why I try to just measure like a kind of a reduced form, like a overall effect of whether it's a positive or negative effect. But I think relating to also Esteban's comments about maybe when the households increase their productivity and accumulate more savings, they will be able to migrate. So it's not directly from having the land titles, but because having better land rights allows them to have higher productivity and higher returns, and that amount of asset will allow them to migrate. So I think a little bit more about that. It's very interesting, and it also depends on how intensive the type of how labor intensive the type of work they're doing. So, and about the destinations. So for most of so in my data, I see. So in my study, I look at migration for education and migration for work. And these two types of migration already make up about 90% of all the samples. And for migration for education, most of them go to big cities. And because in Vietnam, colleges are only available in very big cities. So the migration for education, I don't think there's a lot of choices for destinations. And for work migrations, yeah, I haven't looked at whether they change the way they migrate. It may need to have a longer panel data to observe that. But not all, yeah, so not all migration are rural to urban. Sometimes it's just provincial, like from rural to rural. Yeah, I guess I have to think more about that. But in terms of education migration, I know there's just very limited choices of destinations.
So the nice thing about having Lynn go first is she describes the destinations that are, in a sense, quite consistent across the data sets in terms of really what the draws are. But to Anda's point, I do take it in that all of these decisions are, in a sense, joint decisions, both between departing a location and there's a pull factor, right, about a destination. And it's not only just a decision about if to go, but it's also a question about where to go. And so, as you know, it can be quite difficult to really model that well. But I think in this context, it could very well make sense to use some nonlinear, ordered, let's say, outcomes to really try and distinguish these different effects and reflect a bit better that this is certainly a joint destination, let's say, sorry, joint migration choice. And then with regard to the droughts, I think that you're right. There certainly are destination effects, although they are, let's say, manifested a bit differently, in that, it's possible that there's less employment or closely related to ag work in the city where it would pay better, but also there are increasing prices that might also even be spiking in a different way, because even in the rural area, you might have better access to subsistence consumption. So yeah, I think it's a good point though, because it's actually not well reflected in the current paper, that this is at least a dynamic that is shaping the decision as well, even if we, I would say, can't really quantify it in a I don't know, a precise or maybe eloquent way.
Tolo, you had a question. Why don't you just ask it directly?
Hi guys. I'm not sure if you'll be able to hear me. My connection is quite unstable.
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
But I was just wondering. Oh, awesome. I was just wondering, Lynn, how did you measure rural to rural moves? I'm just wondering how you were able to capture that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, in my main results, all my results are just, I didn't really take into account whether it's rural to rural move or just rural urban move. I just group all of them together. And in my answer previously to Anda, I just, this is just out of observations, because in the data set they have, sometimes they do have people who answer like the location of their, their move. And just by looking at this, I can tell that it's also in the rural area and not in a big city. So it's, I didn't have any measurement of rural to rural migration in my paper, but this is just what I see in the data, because I'm from Vietnam, so I can tell which part is rural and kind of.
Thank you. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
I don't know whether the chair wants to give the authors a minute to wrap up, or
yeah, it would be great also to hear from Virginia, maybe a reaction in response to Lynn's comment, and hear a bit more on the demographic of immigration to Nigeria.
Okay, thank you very much. The question refers to the different challenges we are seeking to address in this scientific work. Thus, we will take into account all the concern for the improvement of the quality of this paper. Concerning the methodology, we are working on dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model in order to test the robustness of our estimate.
however, I have some clarification to make. If we say that immigration plays an important role in the variation of GDP per capita, for example, it means that the variance of the focus error of GDP per capita is explained essentially by its own innovation and those of immigration. In as much as over the period from 1 to 20, the contribution of GDP per capita to this variance varies from 81 to 45, while that of immigration varies from 2 to 86. With regard to the labor, the contribution of its own innovation varies from 87 to 18, while that of immigration increased from 15 to 88, and so on. The choice of Nigeria is explained by the fact that the labor force moved naturally to the area where it's best paid. After the discovery of oil in the 1970s, Nigeria attracts a large number of migrant workers so that its growth rate become higher than that of the Côte d'Ivoire and ECOWAS, as is appear in the presentation.
I'm really sorry to have to cut you off,
Okay.
but we have to stop here, and we can continue this very interesting discussion in the Meet the Authors room.
Okay.
You have all a Zoom link for that. But just before we go, I wanted to thank all the participants for being with us, for your presentations. Thank the IUSSP for this amazing organization. Also thank our colleagues from Population Bureau who are here today and helped us with the videos. Thank the people from Hub as well. And then we look forward to seeing you at our next conference next year in 2021 IUSSP International Population Conference in December. And the call for papers is due on the 15th of May. So do not miss that. And of course, happy holidays for those of you who have a break this year, a well-deserved break. And for those who are able to, please join us in the Meet the Authors. And thank you also, Maury, for co-chairing this panel with me.
Yes, thanks to all. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
See you.
Lovely papers, great presentations.
Thank you.